listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix.
Welcome to the Decarbonisation Dialogue. I am Hannah Walker, and I believe that the best way to communicate a message is by being passionate about what you are talking about. My guest today is Myles Allen. Welcome to Myles, who is an internationally renowned scientist, government advisor, and sought-after commentator. Professor Myles Allen is head of atmospheric, oceanic, and planetary physics in the Department of Physics and Professor of Geosystem Science in the School of Geography and the Environment at the University of Oxford. His research focuses on how human and natural influences on climate contribute to climate change and risks of extreme weather. In 2005, Professor Allen introduced the notion of a finite carbon budget, implying that net zero emissions of carbon dioxide are necessary to halt global warming. He has been working on the implications ever since, and most recently on the case for geological net zero, or a balance between ongoing production of carbon dioxide from geological sources with carbon dioxide capture and geological storage. Professor Allen has served on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In fact, he is such a powerful advocate for the environment that he was dubbed the physicist behind net zero by the BBC and is regularly asked for comment on all things related to climate and weather. Welcome to Myles.
It's great to join you.
So, Myles, you're a very powerful advocate for the environment, and you've been dubbed the physicist behind net zero by the BBC, and you're regularly asked for various comments around climate and weather. Now, can you start by telling us a little bit about how you came to this place, a little bit about your background, because obviously I'm also very curious to hear about your time in Kenya. So how did it start? And let's hear a little bit about that inspiration.
Well, I studied physics and philosophy, in fact, as an undergraduate here in Oxford, but that was the 1980s, and at that time, the kind of jobs I could get at the level of physics I was capable of seemed to mostly involve weapons of mass destruction of one form or another, and I didn't really fancy that work. So I went in a different direction. I took a job with a NGO in Kenya, which was a fantastic privilege for a couple of years to work there. But while I was there, I worked for the United Nations Environment Programme, the energy unit of the UN Environment Programme. And it was a time when climate was still emerging as a topic on the international scene. And my boss, actually, at UNEP, Janos Pastor, advised me very strongly that if I wanted to make a difference, I should quit working for the United Nations and go and get myself a doctorate. So that's what I did. I returned to Oxford. And apart from a short stint at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I've been here ever since.
Back in 2005, you introduced the idea of a finite carbon budget. Can you explain in simple terms what that means and why it matters?
Well, it was a simplification of a lot of work up until that point. We realized that actually, if you wanted to characterize the relationship between emissions and global temperature, the relationship was actually extremely simple. Every ton of carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere drives up global temperature by about the same amount as the last one. In fact, the same amount as whether you released that ton of carbon dioxide back in the 19th century or whether you released it yesterday. The amount by which it drives up global temperature is, of course, subject to scientific uncertainty, but it's about just under 0.5 trillionth of a degree, which may not sound very much, but we emit some 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. And if you do the maths, that's enough to drive up global temperatures by roughly 0.2 of a degree per decade. So that's what's going on. And what it implies, very simply, is if we want to stop global warming getting any worse, we have to stop dumping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And the reason I guess this mattered was that up until that point, people thought that we had to worry about the very complicated relationship, or more complicated relationship at least, between emissions and carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, and the complicated relationship between concentrations, time, and temperature Whereas what this new insight was, if we just sort of cut out the middleman, so to speak, and didn't worry about carbon dioxide concentrations, then we got this very simple relationship between cumulative emissions added up over all time, and whatever temperature you're at.
Do you think that is such a complicated message to communicate? Because we know our oceans and our forests are working overtime and they can't keep absorbing all of these emissions. We talk a lot about net zero, don't we? And I think you've talked about how we could use the fossil fuel industry as a positive, using the technology within that industry to help us on our journey towards net zero. And you talk a lot about how CO2 is captured and stored. Do you think there's a problem in the way we're communicating this?
We've allowed the concept of zero emissions, which, by the way, in the original papers we published back in 2009, and I wasn't the only one, there were 6 papers published in that year, all of which came to essentially the same conclusion, that we needed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero to stop global warming. Now, so we didn't actually use the phrase net zero in those papers. We did talk about zero net emissions, so you could say close to net zero. But what we meant by that was a balance between carbon dioxide that was released from any continued use of fossil fuels and carbon dioxide that was actively captured out of the atmosphere artificially, engineered air capture, purified, compressed, and re-injected back underground. That was the only compensating negative emission that we actually thought about in the papers back in 2009. And there was a simple reason for that. We knew that the oceans and the biosphere were responding to past emissions. But at that time, we couldn't really quantify how much carbon was being taken up in different locations. We just knew that it was happening worldwide, and so we assumed that that process would continue. And when you take into account that natural response of the biosphere, trees and soils, and the oceans to our past emissions, that's when you get this very simple relationship between our own emissions, the carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere, and the temperatures we get. So crucially, what's happened since then, and what has caused a certain amount of muddle, is that people have realized that our oceans and our forests are responding to our past emissions by absorbing a fair amount, about half, in fact, of our ongoing carbon dioxide emissions. And we certainly hope they will continue to do that in the future, because we're counting on that for net zero emissions to stop global warming. But we can't count what Mother Nature is doing for us. We can't count that as if we were doing it ourselves. So when we talked about zero emissions, we only referred to the consequences of the activities we actually do ourselves, like burning a fossil fuel or like capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and re-injecting it back underground. So it was actually a very simple relationship when it was introduced. It's become a lot more complicated as, inevitably, I suppose, as the cost of actually eliminating fossil fuel use or compensating for any remaining fossil fuel use by capturing the carbon dioxide and re-injecting it back underground. As that cost has become clear, people have sort of cast around for other ways of achieving something that looks a bit like net zero, like planting a tree instead. But it just doesn't really work. If we're going to release carbon from the geosphere by pumping up fossil fuels and burning them and releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere, the only way of genuinely compensating for that activity is by capturing carbon and putting it back where it came from, back underground, back into rocks.
It is a complicated term, net zero, and I think I might even use the word ambiguous to describe that term. But can you explain? I do have quite a few questions for you while we've got you here. But can you explain the carbon take-back obligation? And can you explain what that actually means in terms of fossil fuel suppliers? Because you've just mentioned storing fraction of it and how it's generated. In science and government, we talk a lot about the targets, 2050 targets. Can you explain the carbon take-back obligation and especially relate it to I think we've got 100% disposal targets by 2050. How does that work?
If we look at scenarios that deliver the goals of the Paris Agreement and limit global temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial, then in all of them, we achieve that goal. We stop global warming by balancing any remaining fossil fuel use with carbon dioxide capture and storage back underground. So we reach what we call geological net zero, which is the state in which for every ton of carbon dioxide we still generate from using fossil fuels or making cement, 1 ton of carbon dioxide is captured, purified, liquefied, and re-injected back underground. This is what happens in scenarios that meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. So the carbon take-back obligation, in effect, is just a sort of simple way of guaranteeing we achieve that outcome by requiring the entities, companies generally, that take carbon dioxide in the form of fossil carbon out of the ground to put it back. So hence take back. Now, those entities probably don't generate the carbon dioxide itself. Generally, they pump up their fossil fuels and then they sell it to somebody else who burns it. They've got the expertise to actually get rid of the carbon dioxide. So a logical way of dealing with the problem is to apply something which is already recognized in Europe, lots of European legislation, for example, called the principle of extended producer responsibility, whereby if you sell something that generates a waste product, you're obligated to take that waste back from your customer and dispose of it responsibly, rather than allowing it to be dumped in the street or released into the atmosphere. So in a nutshell, carbon take-back is just the application of the principle of extended producer responsibility to fossil fuels. Now, one thing which people immediately sort of worry about is that it would be technically impossible for the fossil fuel industry to start taking back all of the carbon dioxide generated by its own activities and all the products it sells tomorrow. There's no way they could do that. But they could do it if they started now and increased that stored fraction progressively over time until they got to 100% in 25 or 30 years' time. That would be entirely feasible. In fact, I've talked to engineers in the fossil fuel industry. Would you be able to do that? And the answer is always, well, yes, of course we would. You know, they know how to manage, they know how to pump fluids into rock. That's exactly what they do. The idea of the carbon take-back obligation would be to introduce this kind of progressive storage target, which ramps up gradually over time and allows the industry to adjust and allows its customers to adjust. Because one thing's for sure, fossil fuels that don't cause global warming, because the CO2 they generate has been disposed of, will be more expensive than fossil fuels that do. How much more expensive, we don't know, because we don't know how well the industry will do at driving down costs and all the rest of it, but they will be somewhat more expensive just because it's so cheap to throw your CO2 into the atmosphere. So if you can't do that, then the alternative is likely to be more expensive. But of course, if we know it's fossil fuels are going to get more expensive gradually, then we can adjust accordingly. And in fact, the amount by which fossil fuels are likely to get more expensive is actually not as high as you might think. In fact, if you calculate the impact of a carbon take-back obligation that was introduced, hypothetically, if it had been introduced back in 2000, so suppose in the year 2000, we'd introduced a 25-year carbon take-back obligation. The use of fossil fuels in Europe would be carbon neutral today. Solve the problem of fossil fuels causing global warming in Europe for less than petrol prices went up between 2000 and 2008. You know, that puts it into perspective. We could afford this.
Can I ask the question then? And it might be a silly question because you've explained geological net zero very well. And it does lead me to the question. I know we're talking about cost and people's concern, because I do want to talk about ordinary, everyday people, because we're all concerned about what's happening with our pockets and our budgets and energy bills, etc. But if governments or businesses could take one bold action right now, what would it be?
Well, the first thing I'd like every government and every business to do is just acknowledge the need for geological net zero. to say, yes, we're committed to stopping fossil fuels from causing global warming, and we get it, then that means that 1 ton of carbon dioxide has to be captured and disposed of permanently, geologically, back underground for every ton that's still generated from any fossil fuel or cement use after mid-century. If countries and companies would commit to that, make it clearer what they actually mean by net zero, then that focuses minds. Because if you're going to start building out geological CO2 storage capacity at a rate that would allow you to achieve geological net zero by 2050, then you're going to have to start yesterday.
Yes.
I mean, you're going to have, you're going to have to crack on with it. So that immediately has implications. It sounds, 2050 sounds a long way away, but it takes a long time to build the capture facilities, to build the pipelines, to build the storage networks and so on, in order to do this well and to do it safely. The fossil fuel industry is more than capable of doing it, but it will take time.
Yes.
And that's why starting now would be, accepting that's the destination.
Yes.
Setting out our path towards it and getting on with it is what I want people to do.
So we understand the problem, and it sounds like we have got the technology and we have got the expertise and a lot of will, and we've got a lot of expertise in people like yourself. But taking it back to all of us, especially for someone like me, I mean, we kind of, it's easy to get overwhelmed with climate crisis news, isn't it? How do we give people some kind of sense of hope in this as well, so we don't feel like it's just too much?
Absolutely. The main point I would want people to take away is that this is a fixable problem. If we were to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming by mid-century, then we would limit the entirety of future warming to less than has already happened since the 2000s. And that's not a model result. That's just simple geometry. It's just remembering, braking distances from your driving test. I mean, that's how you can work it out. Would we limit the total warming to less than 1.5 degrees? No, because we've already got to 1.5 degrees pretty much. Yes. But we would limit it well below 2 degrees, and that would be a huge result. It won't avoid all impacts of climate change, of course, and we do have to deal with the impacts. But it is something that could be done. And it should be done, because the longer we allow the climate to continue to change, the worse every additional tenth of a degree of warming is for additional impacts. So, we could stop climate change within a generation, but not with the kind of policies we have at the moment. Because at the moment, the kind of policies we have focus overwhelmingly on the emitter, on you or me, the person who generates the carbon dioxide. And we have very little agency, in the sense that we've got not that much control over how we get around or how we heat our homes and so on. To be frank with you, I'm going through the trauma at the moment of trying to fit a heat pump into our house, a new house. And I don't want to put people off, but it's quite a lot of hassle and quite a lot of expense. And if I wasn't really committed to doing it, I might have given up a long time ago. Yeah. So I think there is a problem with the way the issue tends to get cast as just something that's up to the consumer, that up to you or me to solve. And I think people need to recognize, no, ultimately, the people who make the most money out of our continued use of fossil fuels, which is typically the people who earn what we call fossil fuel rents as these fuels come out of the ground, they have a duty, an obligation, a responsibility, whatever you want to call it, to deal with the problem that those fuels cause. And they've got the capacity to do it. They can do it. I can't go and capture the carbon dioxide that comes out of my home boiler and dig a deep hole and put it back underground. But the person who supplies me with the gas could. Yes. And even if they passed on the entire cost of capturing that CO2 back out of the atmosphere and putting it back under the North Sea, that might add 3 or 4 pence per kilowatt hour to my home gas bill. Now, that's not small. I'm not saying that's negligible, but over 25 years, it's the amount I could probably save by insulating the house a bit better anyway.
I think you put that. I do think you put that very well, actually, because we do feel, when we talk about climate crisis, we do kind of feel overburdened, and like you're as you say, trying to install your heat pump, and many of us are trying to work out, can we afford to install a heat pump? How is that going to be practical, etc., etc. And these are all good things that we should be doing, but it's just making it less complicated, I suppose, if we all have a voice, and you certainly have a voice, because you're talking about it a lot, there will be a level of influence there, you would hope, that would so we move forward in terms of the big picture, which is what it requires.
You would hope so. And we have at times got quite close to getting a policy like this enacted. Believe it or not, back in 2015, there was actually an amendment proposed, supported by all three major parties, to the energy bill of 2015, which would have introduced at least the principle of the oil and gas industry paying for carbon capture and storage, paying for the development of carbon dioxide disposal. Interestingly, even though it was supported by all three major parties, it disappeared. It was lobbied out, basically. It was lobbied out by, I was obviously arguing for this amendment. While this was all going on, I was taken out for lunch by a man in a suit from Oil and Gas UK, who spent an hour telling me what a terrible idea it was, and I spent the hour thinking I must be onto something. But, they won. They managed to get rid of it. They didn't like the idea of them having any obligation to do anything. And so it didn't happen. And it won't happen unless governments are willing to stand up to the fossil fuel industry. And that's where you and I do come in. We need to encourage our governments to stand up to the industry and deal with the fact that the industry will, of course, try and frighten everyone with any hint of a new regulation. They'll say, oh, this will send your fuel bills through the roof, it'll be a nightmare, and so on. The reality is, you've got to ask yourself, if the industry is so vehemently against something, are they really that confident they'll be able to pass the entire cost on to their customers? Or will they actually have to absorb some of it in their profits? And, the fact of the matter is that in 2022, the amount we spent on fossil fuels in that year, which admittedly was a strange year, but it just put it into perspective. In 2022, the amount in the world we spent on fossil fuels exceeded total tax revenues of governments. If you simply took away from that the amount it actually cost to deliver those, to pump those fossil fuels out of the ground, to process them and deliver them to our homes, the difference, which was somebody's profit somewhere, would have been enough to capture every single ton of carbon dioxide those fuels generated and disposed of it completely. So they didn't need to cause global warming. So the money is there. Of course, we can't tap into that money overnight. You can't sort of change the way things are too traumatically quickly, but it could be done over 25 years. That's an entire generation for financial systems and so on to adjust, and that would stop fossil fuels from causing further global warming.
So there is something positive, and I do want to end on a positive, because there's a big picture and it's quite complicated as well, because there are so many elements and so many stakeholders involved in this as well, and a lot of work in terms of having an influence and having a voice. But geological net zero is obviously something that we're going to be hearing a lot more about. But if you could take someone on this is not my last question, because I do want to end on a positive. But if you could take someone on a journey to really see the effects or solutions of climate change firsthand, where would you go?
I'd probably go to Texas. You may surprise you of this. An oil and gas company, Occidental Petroleum, is currently completing a factory in Texas that will be pumping air through giant machines, which will be essentially stripping the carbon dioxide out of the air, so they get a clear stream of carbon dioxide coming out of this machine, which they will then pump underground. Now, the reason I'm not saying that company is particularly saintly, or that plant is the solution to all our problems. In fact, there's plenty of reasons why that plant is perhaps more expensive than it need be, and all things, as the company itself would acknowledge. But it demonstrates a way we could use fossil fuels without causing global warming. And I think that's what people need to realize. People get told all the time that global warming is an inevitable consequence of our use of fossil fuels. And so then they feel they can't imagine life without fossil fuels. So they end up thinking, well, global warming is inevitable and I may as well give up. What people need to realize is that global warming is not an inevitable consequence of our use of fossil fuels. It's just a consequence of our lazy tendency to dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere rather than disposing of it responsibly. which means capturing it and putting it back underground. There are other ideas out there, by the way, for disposing of carbon dioxide permanently, like storing it in the oceans, geochemically storing it in the oceans, or turning it back into rock. If those can be shown to work, they might well be more cost effective than actually pumping it back underground. But right now, the only one we do on any scale is pumping it back underground.
Okay, well, so that is a positive. I am going to end on a positive, but I do think we're actually not very good at getting rid of our rubbish, quite frankly. If I could put it that way, we're not actually very good at it, are we? In any sense.
Well, we have made progress. I mean, there was a time when you just chucked your sewage out the window shouting "Garden
Yes,
loo."
we have made progress. There is that.
And we fixed that
Yes.
not by acting on the consumer, so to speak, not by telling people to generate less sewage, although no doubt that would have been helpful. It was by building sewage systems, by building systems to dispose of it responsibly. Now, admittedly, they don't always work, and frequently Thames Water has problems and all that sort of thing. But the principle is there that if somebody supplies me with water, they have a responsibility to dispose of the waste it generates. And exactly the same principle could apply to fossil fuels. And if it did, they would be a little bit more expensive, sure, but life wouldn't need to change that much. And that's an important message for people, which is we don't need massive social change to fix global warming. We'll probably have massive social change over the next 25 years. I have no idea how society is going to change. I couldn't have predicted how it has changed over the past 25 years. But we don't need to make that a condition of solving climate change. We can solve climate change very simply by just putting the onus on people who want to supply fossil fuels to get rid of the CO2 they generate.
Thank you to Myles Allen today for providing such insight. There can be no doubt that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. Today, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels, and please tell us what you think by emailing us at podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. Thank you once again to Myles Allen.
Thank you. Thank you for the conversation. All the best.
You've been listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix. For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.